The stench of decay and desperation clung to the narrow alleys of the Hollow District like a second skin. Lyra Ashwood moved through the shadows with practiced efficiency, her worn cloak pulled tight against the bitter wind that carried whispers of snow and suffering. Her satchel, heavy with stolen herbs and scavenged medical supplies, bumped against her hip as she navigated the maze of crumbling buildings that housed Silvercrest's Forgotten. This was where Omegas without packs came to. Disappear, where the sick and starving waited for death, with hollow eyes and hollower hopes. This was home, and Lyra had long since made peace with that reality. She ducked into a doorway as a royal patrol passed, their polished armor and sneering faces a stark contrast to the filth surrounding them. They were hunting, as they always did on selection nights. Hunting for Omegas who thought they could hide from the Alpha King's summons. Lyra pressed herself against the rotting wood, controlling her breathing, suppressing her scent with the bitter herbs she chewed constantly. It was a trick she had learned from old Mira before the woman had died last winter. One of the few gifts that had kept Lyra alive and unclaimed for 23 years. The patrol moved on, their laughter echoing obscenely in the quiet despair of the district. Lyra waited 5 full minutes before emerging, her heart rate already returning to its perpetual state of controlled tension. She had 3 more patients to see before nightfall, 3 more souls clinging to life in a kingdom that had decided they were worthless the moment they presented as Omega, without the protection of a strong pack. Her fingers found the edge of the scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw, a parting gift from the Alpha who had tried to claim her 5 years ago. She had fought back then, had refused to submit, and the resulting violence had marked her as damaged goods in a society that prized Omega compliance above all else. The official summons had arrived that morning, nailed to every surface in the Hollow District with the King's seal burning silver in the weak sunlight. All unmated Omegas between the ages of 18 and 30 were required to present themselves at the palace for the selection ceremony. Failure to comply would result in immediate execution of the Omega and anyone harboring them. It was signed with Kale Nightshade's distinctive scrawl, the Alpha King, whose name alone could make hardened warriors tremble. Lyra had read it once, torn it down, and tried to pretend her hands weren't shaking. She finished her rounds as the sun began its descent, each patient treated with careful attention, despite the gnawing anxiety in her gut. Mrs. Chen's infected wound was finally healing. The Morrison twins' fever had broken. Young Thomas would likely lose his arm, but he would live, which was more than most could hope for in the Hollow. Lyra left what few supplies she could spare, accepted no payment, because there was none to give, and made her way back to the single room she called home, with the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. The room was barely large enough for a bedroll and a small stove, but it had a door that locked, and a window she could escape through if needed. Lyra sat on the floor, back against the wall, and forced herself to think. She could run. The forests beyond Silvercrest were dangerous, full of rogues and wild magic, but they were vast, and the King's reach only extended so far. She had no pack, no family, nothing tying her to this place except the patients who depended on her skills, and the stubborn refusal to let the kingdom's cruelty win. Running meant abandoning them. Running meant they would die slowly and painfully from infections and illnesses she could treat. Running meant Kale Nightshade would send his hunters into the Hollow District to search every room, and innocent people would suffer for her cowardice. The alternative was equally impossible. Present herself at the palace, stand before the most feared Alpha in 5 generations, and pray that he found her too scarred, too defiant, too obviously broken to bother claiming. The selection ceremony was a formality. Everyone knew that. Kale Nightshade wasn't looking for a mate. He was reminding the kingdom of his absolute power, demonstrating that even the lowest Omega existed at his pleasure and could be called to heel with a single command. He would parade them through his throne room, enjoy their fear and submission, perhaps choose 1 or 2 for his bed, before dismissing the rest with the kind of casual cruelty that had become his signature. Lyra had heard the stories. She had treated the Omegas who had survived previous selections, had held their hands while they sobbed out confessions of humiliation and violation. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance content. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's see what happens when Lyra faces the impossible choice. The decision was made somewhere between midnight and dawn, in that quiet space where fear transforms into resignation. Lyra would go. She would present herself as required. She would endure whatever humiliation Cale Nightshade deemed appropriate, and then she would return to the Hollow and continue her work. She had survived worse. The scar on her face was proof of that. What was one more indignity in a life built on them? She dressed in the only clean clothes she owned, a simple gray dress that had seen better years but was free of bloodstains and medicinal odors. Her hair, an unusual shade of silver white that marked her as different even among Omegas, was braided tightly against her skull. She left the satchel hidden under a loose floorboard, took nothing that could be stolen or used against her, and joined the silent procession of Omegas making their way toward the palace as the sun crested the eastern mountains. There were perhaps 50 of them, though Lyra didn't bother counting. Some were young, barely past their first heat, eyes wide with terror and the foolish hope that being chosen might mean escape from poverty. Others were older, worn down by years of survival, their faces carefully blank as they shuffled forward. No one spoke. What was there to say? They were lambs walking toward the slaughter, and everyone knew it. The only question was which of them would feel the blade. The palace rose before them like a monument to excess and cruelty, all gleaming white stone and silver towers that caught the morning light and threw it back in blinding waves. Guards lined the approach, their expressions carefully neutral, as they watched the Omegas file through the massive gates. Lyra kept her eyes down, not out of submission, but out of strategy. Drawing attention now would be foolish. Better to blend into the crowd, to be forgettable and unremarkable, to survive through invisibility as she always had. They were herded into a vast antechamber, where servants waited with scented oils and fine clothes. The message was clear. They would be made presentable before being brought before their king. Lyra submitted to the process with gritted teeth, allowing strange hands to strip away her simple dress and replace it with a flowing gown of deep emerald that clung to curves she had spent years trying to hide. The oil they rubbed into her skin carried notes of jasmine and something else, something that made her head swim and her instincts scream warnings she couldn't quite interpret. When they reached for her braid, intending to arrange her distinctive hair into some elaborate style, Lyra caught the servant's wrist with more force than she intended. The woman's eyes widened in shock. Omegas didn't grab. Omegas didn't resist. The moment stretched between them, dangerous and electric, before Lyra released her grip and forced her voice into something approximating politeness. "Leave it," she said. "The scar shows better this way. Let him see what he's getting." The servant backed away quickly, perhaps recognizing that some damage couldn't be concealed with pretty clothes and perfumed skin. Lyra was grateful. The braid was armor of a sort, a small assertion of self in a situation designed to strip away every shred of autonomy. The throne room was exactly as obscene as she had imagined. Vaulted. Ceilings disappeared into shadows far above, held aloft by columns carved with scenes of conquest and submission. Tapestries depicting the Nightshade family's bloody rise to power covered the walls, each image more violent than the last. And at the far end of the room, elevated on a dais of black marble, sat the throne itself, and the man who had turned it into a symbol of absolute terror. Cale Nightshade was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, all lean muscle and lethal grace, contained in a deceptively civilized package. His hair was dark as midnight, falling to his shoulders in waves that suggested aristocratic negligence. His eyes, visible even from this distance, were the color of winter storms, gray and merciless and ancient beyond his 30 years. He wore black, because of course he did, the formal attire of Silvercrest royalty, tailored to emphasize the raw power contained in his frame. Everything about him screamed danger. Everything about him promised pain to those foolish enough to challenge his authority. Lyra felt the pull immediately, a tugging sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something far more primal. She shoved it down viciously, attributing it to the scented oils or the oppressive atmosphere or simple self-preservation instinct gone haywire. She would not be attracted to this man. She would not give him that power over her. She had spent too many years building walls around her heart to let them crumble at the sight of a pretty face attached to a monster's soul. The ceremony began with a speech, delivered by some minor official whose name Lyra didn't bother learning. Platitudes about duty and honor and the sacred bond between Alpha and Omega, all of it carefully designed to make their subjugation sound noble. Lyra stopped listening after the first minute, focusing instead on her breathing, on the cool marble beneath her feet, on anything except the suffocating reality of her situation. She watched other Omegas from the corner of her eye, noting who was trembling, who was crying silently, who had the dangerous look of someone about to do something spectacularly stupid. She catalogued exits, counted guards, calculated the chances of making it to the door if everything went wrong. Not good, but not impossible. Never impossible. Then, Kale Nightshade stood, and the entire room fell into a silence so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. He descended from the dais with fluid grace, each step measured and deliberate, and began to walk among them. This was the part everyone had whispered about, the part where he would inspect them like livestock, making his judgment with a glance or a touch or sometimes, according to the darkest rumors, a taste. Lyra kept her eyes down as he passed the first row, then the second. She could feel his presence like heat, could smell the cedar and smoke that seemed to cling to him, could sense the barely contained violence that made even the guards shift nervously. He stopped in front of a young Omega-3 positions to Lyra's left. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, pretty in a conventional way, and absolutely terrified. Kaya lifted her chin with one finger, studied her face for a long moment, then moved on without comment. The girl's sob of relief was audible. He continued down the line, sometimes pausing, sometimes barely glancing, his expression never changing from that mask of cold assessment. Then he was standing directly in front of Lyra, and the tugging sensation in her chest exploded into something that felt like lightning coursing through her veins. "Kneel," he said. His voice was exactly what she had expected, deep and commanding, layered with alpha authority that could force submission from the weakest-willed Omega. Lyra felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, felt her knees begin to bend in automatic response to a dominance she had no defense against. Every instinct screamed at her to obey, to submit, to bare her throat and accept whatever fate this creature decreed. But beneath those instincts, buried under years of survival and suffering, something else stirred, something that had been sleeping so long Lyra had forgotten it existed, something that recognized the command for what it was and rejected it with absolute fury. She looked up instead, meeting those winter storm eyes with her own gaze that had been forged in the fires of the Hollow District and tempered by every indignity she had endured. She saw his pupils dilate in shock, saw something flicker across his face that might have been confusion or recognition, or fear. The entire throne room held its breath. Omegas didn't look alphas in the eye. Omegas certainly didn't look the Alpha King in the eye. The punishment for such defiance was well documented and creatively brutal. "I said kneel," Kale repeated, and this time there was an edge to his voice that suggested violence was imminent. The pressure increased, his alpha will bearing down on her like a physical weight. Lyra felt her body screaming at her to comply, felt her Omega instincts clawing at her consciousness in desperate attempts to force submission. But that other thing, that awakening presence that felt too large for her skin, pushed back with equal force. Her knees locked, her spine straightened, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "No," she said simply. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward in waves of disbelief. Somewhere behind her someone gasped. A guard's hand moved to his weapon. Kale Nightshade stared at her as if she had spontaneously transformed into something previously thought mythical. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife's edge between violence and something Lyra couldn't name. Then it happened. The bond snapped into place with enough force to drive Lyra to her knees, after all, not from submission but from the sheer overwhelming sensation of her soul recognizing its other half and screaming in joy and terror. She felt Kale stagger, saw his hand shoot out to grip the shoulder of the nearest guard for balance. His eyes were wild now, no longer cold but burning with shock, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. The scent of cedar and smoke intensified until it was all Lyra could breathe, mixing with her own scent in a way that should have been impossible. Omegas and alphas could form bonds, yes, but not like this. Not with this intensity. Not with this absolute certainty that felt like the universe itself had reached down and tied them together with chains made of starlight and necessity. "What are you?" Kale whispered, and the question sounded more like an accusation. Lyra wanted to answer, wanted to explain that she didn't know, that she had never felt anything like this, that something was waking up inside her that terrified her, more than his threats ever could. But before she could form words, pain exploded through her body with enough force to steal her breath. It felt like her bones were trying to rearrange themselves, like her blood had turned to liquid fire, like every cell in her body was screaming for transformation into something she didn't have words for. She heard someone shouting orders, felt hands grabbing her arms, and then everything dissolved into white-hot agony and the distant sound of Kale Nightshade, roaring at his guards to get their hands off her. The last thing she registered before consciousness abandoned her was the feeling of strong arms lifting her carefully, the scent of cedar and smoke wrapping around her like a blanket, and a voice close to her ear saying something that sounded like impossible, over and over again, like a prayer or a curse. "If you're enjoying this intense scene, don't forget to drop a comment below, letting me know what you think is happening to Lyra. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is about to get even more complicated." Lyra woke in luxury so profound it was obscene. Silk sheets, softer than anything she had touched in her entire life, cocooned her in warmth. The bed itself was massive, easily large enough for 4 people, with posts of carved darkwood reaching toward a ceiling painted with constellations she didn't recognize. Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked gardens so perfectly, maintained they looked artificial. Everything about the room screamed wealth and power, a direct insult to the poverty she had left behind in the Hollow District that morning. Or was it morning? Lyra had no idea how much time had passed. She sat up slowly, taking inventory of her body with practiced efficiency. The pain was gone, replaced by a strange tingling sensation that seemed to live just beneath her skin. Her muscles felt different, stronger, coiled with potential energy she didn't understand. And underneath everything was the bond, that impossible connection to Kale Nightshade, humming like a living thing in her chest. She could feel him even now, could sense his presence somewhere in the palace, could taste his emotions like flavor on her tongue. Confusion, anger, fear. The fear surprised her. What did the Alpha King have to fear from a scarred Omega from the Hollow District? The door opened without warning, and a woman entered carrying a tray laden with food. She was middle-aged, dressed in the plain but well-made clothes of upper household staff, and her scent marked her as a beta. Her face was carefully neutral as she set the tray on a side table and turned to assess Lyra with shrewd eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. "You're awake," the woman said, her tone suggesting this was simultaneously expected and problematic. "Good. His Majesty has been." She paused, searching for a diplomatic word, concerned. Lyra almost laughed at that. Concerned was an interesting way to describe the roiling mixture of emotions she could feel through the bond, none of which resembled anything approaching care or worry, more like rage and confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to possessiveness. "Where am I?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. The woman's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. "The king's private wing. You've been unconscious for 2 days. The healers." She paused again. They don't know what. Happened to you? One moment you were dying, the next you were… She gestured vaguely at Lyra. This. Whatever this is. Lyra looked down at herself. Really looked for the first time since waking. Her skin seemed to glow with health, the perpetual pallor of malnutrition replaced by vibrant vitality. The scar on her face, her constant companion for 5 years, had faded to a thin silver line. Her hands, usually rough and calloused from her work, were smooth and strong, and her scent, she could smell. It now had changed completely. Gone was the submissive sweetness of Omega, replaced by something sharp and wild and utterly commanding, something that smelled like Kale Nightshade's equal, not his subordinate. I need to see him, Lyra said, surprised by the authority in her own voice. The woman's eyes widened fractionally before she nodded and left without argument. That was new. Yesterday, or 3 days ago, or whenever she had last been conscious and herself, no servant would have taken orders from her. Omegas didn't give orders. They received them. But she wasn't entirely Omega anymore, was she? Whatever had happened during that moment of transformation in the throne room had fundamentally changed her on a level she was only beginning to comprehend. Kale Nightshade arrived within minutes, and Lyra felt his approach through the bond long before the door opened. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usual predatory grace frayed at the edges by exhaustion and stress. His eyes found hers immediately, and the force of the connection between them made the air in the room feel electric. They stared at each other for a long moment, two apex predators trying to determine if they were partners or threats, while the bond sang between them with increasing urgency. "You're true alpha," Kale said finally, and his voice carried wonder and horror in equal measure. Lyra blinked, the term meaning nothing to her. True alpha. She had never heard it before, had no context for what it meant, or why it made Kale look like his entire world had just been turned inside out. He crossed the room slowly, every movement telegraphed and careful, as if approaching something that might bolt or attack without warning. "It's a bloodline," he continued, stopping just beyond arm's reach, maintaining careful distance even as the bond pulled at both of them like a riptide. They were extinct, or so everyone believed. True alphas don't present as alpha during puberty like the rest of us. They, present as Omega, hide among the lowest tier of society until something triggers their true nature. Usually death, usually violence. Sometimes, he swallowed hard, a mate bond with another alpha. The implications crashed over Lyra like a tidal wave. Every beating she had endured, every time someone had tried to force her submission, every moment of violence and violation had been attempts to kill her before she could awaken. The alphas who had hurt her had somehow known, on an instinctive level, that she was dangerous, that she was a threat to the entire social order that gave them power. And they had tried to eliminate that threat before it could manifest. "Your family," Kale said quietly, and his guilt flooded through the bond so intensely that Lyra gasped. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. But my father," he paused, and Lyra saw him struggle with words that felt like betrayal. "My father led the purge 20 years ago. Every true alpha bloodline we could find. Men, women, children. He said it was necessary to maintain order, to prevent war, to protect the kingdom. I was 10 years old, and I watched him give the orders that murdered your parents." Lyra felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 20 years ago, she had been 3 years old, too young to remember faces or voices or anything except the vague sensation of being loved and safe. She had been found wandering the ruins of her village by old Mira, who had hidden her in the Hollow District and taught her to suppress her scent and her instincts, who had died protecting a secret she never fully explained, who had known exactly what Lyra was and had spent her last years ensuring the knowledge died with her, or would have if not for an impossible mate bond that shattered every carefully constructed lie. "You killed my family," Lyra said, and her voice was ice despite the rage burning through her veins. Kale flinched but didn't deny it. "I was a child. I didn't understand what he was doing until much later. By the time I took the throne, the damage was done. The true alpha lines were gone, or so I thought. He looked at her with something that might have been desperation. If I had known you existed, if I had any idea, I would have. He stopped, because what could he say? That he would have protected her? Welcomed her? Treated her as an equal instead of an omega to be used and discarded? The bond pulsed between them, making lies impossible. Lyra could feel his truth, could sense that he genuinely hadn't known about the surviving true alpha bloodlines, that he carried guilt for his father's actions like a weight that threatened to crush him. But she could also feel his fear of what she represented, power equal to his own, a challenge to his throne, a mate bond that could either legitimize his rule or provide the spark that ignited revolution across the kingdom. What happens now? Lyra asked, because that was the only question that mattered. Do you kill me to finish what your father started? Do you lock me away and pretend I don't exist? Do you use the bond to control me, make me your puppet queen to parade before the court? Kale's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. I can't kill you. The bond would drive me insane before your body was cold. I can't lock you away because you're too powerful now, and you'll only grow stronger. And I can't control you because true alphas don't submit to anyone, not even their mates. He moved closer, and this time Lyra didn't. Retreat. I have a kingdom built on lies and oppression. I have a court full of alphas who will see you as a threat to be eliminated. I have omega populations in every province who will rally to you the moment they learn what you are. The mate bond ensures I can't betray you without destroying myself, but it doesn't guarantee you'll choose to stand with me rather than against me. So tell me, Lyra Ashwood, true alpha of a murdered bloodline, what do you want to happen now? It was, Lyra realized, the first time anyone with power had ever asked her what she wanted. The first time her desires had mattered more than her designation, or her usefulness, or her compliance. She looked at Kale Nightshade, this man who was her mate and her enemy, and her only potential ally all at once, and made a choice that would reshape the kingdom. I want justice, she said clearly, not revenge, though I have every right to it. Justice. For every omega rotting in the Hollow District while your nobles feast on delicacies. For every true alpha murdered before they could awaken. For every law that treats sentience as hierarchy rather than equality. If we're bound together, then we remake this kingdom together, or I burn it down and build something better from the ashes. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of war and a proposal of peace simultaneously. Kyle stared at her, and through the bond she felt his emotions shift like storm clouds, rearranging themselves into new patterns. The fear was still there, but it was transforming into something else. Respect, perhaps, or recognition that the true alpha standing before him was exactly the kind of strength his kingdom needed, even if accepting that meant surrendering the absolute power he had always assumed was his birthright. Then we remake it, he said finally, and extended his hand toward her, not as king to subject, but as equal to equal. I can't promise it will work. The court will fight us every step of the way. There will be assassination attempts and rebellions and political nightmares I can't even imagine yet. But if you're willing to try, if you'll stand beside me rather than against me, then we'll transform this kingdom or die trying. Lyra took his hand, and the moment their skin touched, the bond flared bright enough to blind. This was the point of no return, she knew. Once they chose this path together, there would be no going back to the careful distance that might have kept them safe from the consequences of their connection. But safety had never been her priority. Survival was, and justice, and the stubborn determination to ensure that no one else had to endure what she had endured. If that meant binding herself to the Alpha King and his blood-soaked throne, then so be it. Their first target was obvious: the Hollow District and the systematic neglect that had turned it into a graveyard for Omegas without packs. Kale convened his council 3 days after Lyra's awakening, and the shock on their faces when she walked into the chamber at his side, wearing the silver circlet of a recognized mate, was almost comical. Almost. Except Lyra could smell their fear and rage, could see the calculations behind their eyes as they tried to determine if she was a threat or an opportunity to exploit. My mate, Kale announced, and his tone made it clear that argument would be unwise, has brought several concerns to my attention regarding conditions in the lower districts. Concerns that we will be addressing immediately with comprehensive reform. The council erupted in protests. Lords and ladies who had built their fortunes on the subjugation of Omegas suddenly discovering passionate concern for tradition and budget limitations and the natural order of things. Lyra listened to their arguments for exactly 5 minutes before she had heard enough. She stood, and her true alpha presence rolled through the room like thunder, forcing silence through sheer force of will. "I have lived in the Hollow District for 20 years, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I have treated infections that could have been prevented with basic sanitation. I have watched children starve while your banquet halls overflow with waste. I have held the hands of dying Omegas who committed no crime except being born into a designation you decided made them worthless. And now I stand before you as true alpha and mate to your king, and I am telling you that this ends. Now, today, you will allocate funds for clean water, adequate housing, and medical facilities in every district. You will reform labor laws that exploit Omega workers. You will establish protections for those without pack affiliations." Or, she let her alpha power surge visibly, making the air shimmer with barely contained force. "You will explain to me why you believe your comfort matters more than their survival." The council caved within the week, though Lyra had no illusions that it was from sudden moral clarity rather than fear of what she might do if they refused. Money was allocated. Construction began. Healers were dispatched with supplies and salaries that might actually keep them from abandoning their posts. It was far from perfect, far from enough, but it was a start. And more importantly, it sent a message through the kingdom that power had shifted in ways the old guard couldn't ignore. The assassination attempt started shortly after. Poison in her food, an ambush in the palace gardens, a suspicious fire in the wing where she and Kale kept their private chambers. Each attempt was thwarted by the combination of her true alpha instincts, Kale's paranoid security measures, and the bond between them that made them hyper-aware of threats to each other. They interrogated the would-be assassins, traced the conspiracy back through layers of noble houses and merchant guilds who had profited from the old system. Some were executed, others stripped of titles and lands. A few agreed to support the reforms in exchange for clemency that Lyra granted only after extracting binding oaths enforced by magic older than the kingdom itself. Through it all, the bond between them deepened in ways neither had anticipated. What began as an impossible connection between enemies evolved into partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Kale opened the royal archives to Lyra, giving her access to centuries of history that had been carefully hidden from public knowledge. She learned that true alphas had once ruled alongside traditional alphas, creating a balance of power that prevented tyranny. She learned that her own bloodline had been among the most influential, known for their ability to heal and to sense truth, which made them dangerous to those who built empires on lies. She learned that the mate bond between true alphas and traditional alphas was considered sacred, a union that could produce heirs with unprecedented abilities. She also learned about Kale's own history in ways the bond couldn't fully convey, how he had taken the throne at 16 after his father's sudden death, a death that palace rumor attributed to everything from disease to poison to divine judgment, how he had spent his early reign trying to undo some of his father's worst excesses while maintaining enough fear to prevent civil war, how he had become the monster everyone believed him to be, because monsters were respected in ways that compassionate rulers weren't. And respect was the only thing keeping the kingdom from tearing itself apart. It didn't excuse his cruelty, didn't erase the pain he had caused, but it complicated the simple narrative Lyra had constructed of him as pure villain. Their physical relationship developed slowly, carefully, with a tenderness that surprised them both. The bond demanded consummation, pulled at them with increasing urgency as weeks passed, but they resisted the easy path of giving in to pure instinct. When they finally came together, 6 weeks after the selection ceremony that had changed everything, it was as equals who had chosen each other, not because of the bond, but in spite of it. It was fierce and gentle, and complicated, layered with all the history and pain and hope between them. And when it was over, Lyra curled against Cale's chest and felt, for the first time in her life, truly safe. The transformation of the kingdom was neither quick nor easy. Opposition came from every corner, from noble houses that saw their power eroding to commoners who feared change more than they hated oppression. Lyra traveled to every province, meeting with Omega communities and listening to their stories, building support from the ground up while Cale worked the political machinery of court. They discovered 3 more true Alpha bloodlines that had survived in hiding, brought them into the palace, and began training them to take positions of authority throughout the kingdom. The old hierarchy was crumbling, replaced by something more fluid, more just, though the birth pains of the new order were often violent and always exhausting. 2 years after the selection ceremony, Lyra stood on the balcony overlooking the capital and marveled at how much had changed. The Hollow District was unrecognizable, transformed into a thriving community with proper infrastructure and opportunity. Omega rights were enshrined in law, enforced by a judicial system that true alphas had infiltrated at every level. The palace itself had been opened to the public, its obscene wealth redistributed to fund schools and hospitals and programs that gave everyone, regardless of designation, a chance at better lives. It wasn't perfect. There was still poverty and injustice and corruption that would take generations to fully eliminate. But it was better. Measurably, undeniably better. Cale joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're thinking too loudly," he murmured, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Lyra leaned back into his embrace, feeling the bond hum contentedly between them. "I'm thinking about how impossible this seemed, how certain I was that you would either kill me or try to control me, how sure you were that I would destroy everything you'd built. And somehow we're here instead." She gestured at the city below, building something neither of us could have created alone. Cale's arms tightened around her. "I never wanted to be the villain of someone's story," he said quietly. "But I didn't know how to be anything else until you showed me there was another option." "You didn't give me an option," Lyra corrected gently. "You gave me an ultimatum. Transform or be destroyed. I just chose transformation because I was too stubborn to give you the satisfaction of destroying me." His laugh rumbled through his chest into her back, warm and genuine, in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over a kingdom that was slowly, painfully learning to value justice over hierarchy, compassion over cruelty, partnership over domination. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that minstrels sang about, where true love conquered all and everyone lived happily without complication. It was messy and difficult and required constant vigilance to maintain, but it was real, and for 2 people who had spent most of their lives fighting just to survive, real was more than enough. Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed Lyra and Cale's journey from enemies to partners in transforming their kingdom. Drop a comment below telling me what your favorite moment was, and don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural romance stories that explore themes of power, justice, and impossible love. 5 years after the selection ceremony, on a spring morning that carried the scent of blooming flowers and possibility, Lyra gave birth to twins. A boy and a girl, both with her Mao. Silver-white hair and Cale's storm-gray eyes, the healers examined them with wonder and trepidation, declaring them healthy and strong and carrying the markers of both true Alpha and traditional Alpha bloodlines in unprecedented combination. They would be powerful, the healers predicted, perhaps the most powerful leaders the kingdom had ever seen if they were raised with wisdom and compassion, rather than fear and cruelty. Lyra held her children and thought about the life they would have, so different from her own childhood of survival and suffering. They would grow up in a palace that was no longer a monument to excess, but a center of governance focused on justice. They would be taught that designation was about capability, not hierarchy, that Omega and Alpha and Beta were simply different expressions of strength rather than rankings of worth. They would never know what it meant to be powerless and forgotten in a hollow district while those with privilege looked away. And if the kingdom backslid, if the old prejudices tried to reassert themselves after she and Cale were gone, her children would have the tools and the power and the education to fight back and preserve what their parents had built. Cale sat beside her on the bed, reaching out to gently stroke his daughter's tiny hand. "What will we name them?" he asked, his voice soft with awe. Lyra looked down at her son, so small and perfect, and full of potential, then at her daughter, who was already exhibiting the stubborn willfulness that ran in her true alpha bloodline. "We'll name them after hope," she said finally, "because that's what they represent. Proof that the past doesn't have to dictate the future, that two people from opposite sides of an unjust system can create something better together, that change is possible, even when it seems impossible." They named the boy Lysander, which meant liberator, and the girl Aurelia, which meant golden dawn. And as Lyra watched her children sleep in their father's arms, she made a silent promise to them, and to every child who would come after them. The kingdom they inherited would continue to evolve, continue to grow toward true equality, continue to prove that power shared was stronger than power hoarded. She had been the Alpha King's mate who refused to kneel, and in that refusal, she had found not just her own power, but the path toward transforming an entire society. It was a legacy worth fighting for, worth the scars and the struggles and the impossibly complicated love that had made it all possible. And as she drifted into exhausted sleep beside her family, Lyra smiled, knowing that the story she had begun in defiance would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by everyone who believed that justice was worth the cost of change.